I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at continued involvement in World War II. We're looking at how the United States tried to stay neutral as World War II really got off and running. We're going to kind of understand the course of the early years of fighting in Europe. We're going to explain Roosevelt's foreign policy during the mid-1930s. Look at the big debate that went on in the United States between whether or not we should get involved, which was the interventionalists, or those who wanted to see the United States stay out of the conflict in Europe. These were the isolationists. Look at how the United States became more and more involved, even if it was indirectly through aiding the Allies with supplies. Question 1 is partially based on the photographs that you see on the screen. Why did other nations, including the United States, feel threatened by the Japanese attacks on China? The Japanese were showing no regard whatsoever for the lives of civilians. The attack, especially in Nanjing, was brutal evidence of their aggressive nature. Japan bombed and terrorized the cities. You see the photographs there from Nanjing, basically bodies piled up on the left side there. The city on fire. You can see children there, kind of with a horrified, and the young girl in the forefront of the photo looks like she's injured. So women, children, elderly, all victims of the brutal Japanese attacks on China. Okay, when you look at President Roosevelt gave a speech. It's called a quarantine speech. When you look at the word quarantine, kind of understand a quarantine from modern day society with dealings with the pandemic. Roosevelt compared a war to a contagious disease, and he wanted the United States to avoid war by quarantining the aggressive countries, basically not getting involved, kind of placing embargoes on trade, and basically isolating the aggressive countries during the 1930s. However, Roosevelt was realistic enough to realize that a quarantine cannot last forever, and that kind of compares nicely to a contagious disease. As much as you want to stop the spread of a disease, as we've seen in history, it's been very difficult to do so, kind of like a plague that eventually does spread. He knew the United States would eventually be forced to be involved in World War II. So while he remained isolated in commentary, behind the scenes, he was planning for an eventual American involvement in the war, which is going to kind of play out in a positive fashion eventually for the United States. You're looking at 3 as the war breaks out in Europe. Why did Germany and the Soviet Union sign the Nonaggression Pact in August of 1939? Germany wanted to avoid going to war with the Soviet Union. If you think about the leaders of those countries, Adolf Hitler in Germany, Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, both very aggressive dictators, neither one of whom would be very comfortable with the other country moving and extending control towards their borders. So they figured best course of action would be to look at the spoils of a victory, a military victory, which would be Poland, where they can kind of split up the eastern western half of Poland. So this would allow Germany, hopefully in their mind, to avoid a 2-front war. As we've seen throughout history, when you fight in a multiple front, it splits up your forces and troops and makes it a little bit more difficult to wage war. Question 4, what happened on September 1st, 1939? Germany invades Poland. We have a little map here. Great Britain and France declare war on Germany. World War II officially began. So if you look at the newspaper headlines, German army attacks Poland, cities bombed, port blockaded, Danzig accepted into the Reich. If you look at the map there, you can see the extension of the German troops. Okay, when you look at number 5, explain Germany's blitzkrieg tactics. Well, if anybody is a fan of professional football, you're probably well aware or familiar with the idea of a blitz in football. A blitz in football is a situation where you're attempting to destroy and attack the quarterback. You usually send an overwhelming number of defenders, more than the offensive line can block. So there's 5 offensive linemen. You send at least 6 or 7 defenders towards the quarterback in hopes of wiping him out and tackling him and sacking him as quickly as possible. Same basic premise for the German blitzkrieg tactics. Overwhelming, fast, mobile forces, hoping to defeat their enemies in a very rapid fashion. And, unfortunately, that's going to happen to a lot of the countries throughout Europe during this period of time. After the Soviet Union invaded Eastern Poland, what other nations did they invade? Well, they invaded the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And they basically run in this area here that's just off the map. So basically what Germany's trying to do is they're trying to wipe out and take control of the weaker countries throughout Europe during this period of time. Once Hitler secured his eastern border, which is Poland here and the Baltic countries, he then moved on to Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. So you see Denmark located here. It's basically the peninsula that's on the just north of Germany. And then you have Norway across the sea. Then you have the Netherlands. You have tiny Luxembourg here, Belgium, and then obviously after that it's going to be on to France. What evidence supports the idea that the German blitzkrieg was successful? The speed of Germany's conquest showed the effectiveness of Hitler's tactics. France is going to fall in just 35 short days. Poland fell very rapidly as well. Photograph there, as you can see, some of the smaller tanks of the Germans are moving into the French countryside. Even though the invasion of France was a German success, what did Germany fail to do? Well, Germany was unable to capture the bulk of the Allied forces. You see here, Allied forces are basically pinned along the English Channel here. They're basically pinned up against the English Channel with nowhere to go at that point in time. The Germans could have finished off another 200,000 or 300,000 Allied troops. But instead, the British Prime Minister at the time, Winston Churchill, who had taken over for the failure, which was Neville Chamberlain, he basically gave a dramatic speech to the English citizens, and he requested that any British citizen who owned a sailboat, a speedboat, a rowboat, a tugboat, whatever it might be, help to evacuate the Allied troops across the English Channel. The English Channel at some of the more narrow points, maybe 15 miles, 20 miles across. So even if you didn't have the greatest boat, you had a pretty good opportunity to at least get it safely across the English Channel. Of course, that's if you're not hit by the German Luftwaffe or Air Force who were trying to fire upon the ships who were evacuating. But he did help rescue in what is remembered as the miracle at Dunkirk, over 300,000 Allied troops across the English Channel who would be able to fight another day. There was a pretty good film that came out, a major motion picture, maybe about 3 years ago, with the title Dunkirk, that actually depicted this particular miracle. Winston Churchill was said to say he would never surrender. He told the citizens that he would fight the Germans on the beaches, across the shores. He basically united the British citizens. It showed Germany that Britain would never give up, and improved the British morale to know that their leader was confident that they would persevere. How did Germany divide France? Northern France was directly controlled by Germany. Southern France organized into Vichy France, which was governed with a puppet government, a government that had French leadership but was controlled indirectly by the Germans. Once France was under German control, naturally they would then attack the British across the English Channel. The Battle of Britain, as it's remembered, started in July of 1940. Okay, when you look at 13, identify the events surrounding the Battle of Britain. Germany launched a massive air campaign against Great Britain by using their Luftwaffe. I just bolted it out just to make sure that you knew that it's the German Air Force. The RAF, or the Royal Air Force, which represents the British, they fought ferociously and courageously to repel the air raids. Germany attacked military targets as well as civilian targets in heavily populated cities. Eventually, though, Germany is going to be forced to give up on its campaign to invade Great Britain. The British Royal Air Force inflicted heavy losses on the Germans. Great Britain had the advantage of radar to counter the German air raids. Great Britain had just introduced one of the most advanced fighter planes, the Spitfire, which was doing a pretty good job of knocking out German Luftwaffe planes. So basically, if you think about it from Hitler's perspective, let's say he would send out 100 planes every night to bomb Great Britain. And even if he was only losing 1 or 2 planes per night, over days, weeks, and months, you can see through attrition, they're losing probably hundreds of aircraft and pilots as they attempt to take over Great Britain. So once again, the fact that Great Britain's an island nation served as a indirect protection for them. It's very difficult, obviously, to get troops ashore. So unlike where France, the Germans just basically rolled across the border. Here, in this case here, they had to do it through a air assault. How did the people of Great Britain keep up their morale during the events at the beginning of World War II? If you look here, you can see a photograph there. A lot of them were forced to stay, at least temporarily, in areas such as the underground tunnels. They were inspired by Churchill's words and bold actions, as well as by victories and the escape at Dunkirk, the Battle of Great Britain. They found ways to survive, such as using the air raid shelters. This increased their confidence that eventually they would persevere and defeat the Germans. You can see here, basically they've made themselves a home, sleeping bags, pillows, blankets. The entire underground subway there are basically bomb shelters at this point in time for the constant bombings that the Germans were delivering to London. So while this is going on, America is debating what they should do. The two sides here are the isolationists versus the interventionalists. The isolationists, the United States should avoid all alliances. Alliances can get you dragged into a war. Remember, too, the United States is still preoccupied with the Great Depression and financial issues, and obviously fighting in a war is very expensive. Some argued American involvement in World War I was a mistake. On the other hand, you had the interventionists. These were people who wanted to work with other countries, believed the United States, as a world power, had a responsibility to help out for the collective security of the world. They argued that Axis powers, the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese, had direct threats towards American interests. The United States should defend allies who were fighting for freedom and democracy. To help govern American policy during the early years of the war, we had a series of neutrality acts that were passed. The Neutrality Acts of 1935, 6, and 7 outlawed Americans from traveling on the ships of belligerent nations. Once again, we're learning from the mistakes of the past. We did see many Americans, roughly 128 of which died aboard the Lusitania during the period of time of World War I when that ship was sunk. Nearly 1,200 people in total were on that large cruise ship, and it was sunk just off the coast of Ireland. And we were traveling on a British ship, which was obviously the Brits were at war at that time with the Germans. The Germans sunk that ship. So to try and learn from that mistake, we're trying to keep American citizens safe by not going on the ships of belligerent countries or countries at war. The United States could not make loans or sell weapons to nations at war. As America saw the cruelty of German aggression, how did the Neutrality Act of 1939 try to help the Allies yet remain neutral at the same time? So it's kind of a very difficult balance for the United States. We sold supplies and weapons to the nations at war, but they had to pay cash, kind of a cash and carry policy. Great Britain had built a large navy, which only allowed them to access American supplies. What steps did the United States take that indicated it was prepping for war itself? Well, one important thing we did is we had the Selective Service Act. This signaled the United States was gearing up for war. This was requiring American citizens, young men, to register and get trained for military service. Another thing we did is the exchange of battleships. We sent battleships to the British. In exchange, the Brits would give us islands around the world where we could set up naval bases. So it was a battleship for bases deal. We knew that the United States would likely get involved, and we did. It would be on the side of the Brits. So coming up with a deal for them was a positive thing in Roosevelt's mind. By having bases around the globe, this would kind of give the United States a staging area to eventually help out during World War II. As the war continued moving forward, two distinctive alliances were taking shape. On the one side, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Allies, and we're going to see how the Soviet Union ends up being on the side of the Allies in a little bit. Eventually, Hitler's going to double-cross Stalin and invade the Soviet Union. The Allies are Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and then the United States. We would get involved in 1941. So President Roosevelt put forth some broad ideas in January 1941. He said that the four freedoms must be protected around the world. Freedom of speech, meaning all citizens around the world should have the right to speak out. All citizens should have freedom of worship, to choose what religion they'd like to worship. Freedom from want, this during the latter part here of the Great Depression. The idea that all citizens should have access to basic necessities, food, shelter, clothing. And freedom from fear, we should not have a dictator or leader of a country threatening its citizens. Another program the United States got involved with to help out the British is the Lend-Lease Act. Here, Roosevelt said he wanted to help out the Brits. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, called the United States the great arsenal for democracy. This act authorized the United States to supply the Allies with weapons and ships. The United States loaned $40 billion during the war to the Allies. So basically what the United States is doing here, once again, is finding a way around getting directly involved, but while at the same point in time indirectly helping out the Allies. In August of 1941, President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill secretly met off the coast of Newfoundland in the Atlantic Ocean. Why was this such an important meeting? Here, the United States and the British Prime Minister pledged to first defeat Germany, then focus on Japan. So even before the United States got involved, Roosevelt was planning out with Churchill a course of action. The two agreed to the Atlantic Charter. The document put forth post-war victory goals of self-determination, meaning countries should no longer be colonies, a new international system of security, which would become the United Nations for world peace. 24, why did the United States and Great Britain agree that their priority was defeating Germany first and then Japan? Well, Germany was directly threatening the British, so therefore the fear for Churchill was for his own safety and for his own country. And then geographically, Germany much closer to Great Britain and then Japan. '25, how did the Lend-Lease Act and the Atlantic Charter move the United States away from neutrality? The Lend-Lease Act increased American help, support, and aid to Great Britain. The Atlantic Charter demonstrated a deeper tie and alliance between the United States and Great Britain. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill gave the United States a moral reason to fight the Axis powers. 6, Roosevelt declared the ideals he felt America should fight for, the 4 freedoms, in his speech. In the Atlantic Charter, Churchill and Roosevelt outlined their vision for a post-war world. What do these 2 documents have in common? Both describe a world that would ensure basic human rights and freedoms in which people felt safe and secure. And finally, the lesson reflection. What factors or principles should impact a nation's decision to go to war? Well, number 1, you have to defend yourself. So if you're attacked, you need to defend yourself. Secondly, national security. If your national security interests are involved, most certainly you should be involved in a war. And of course, if you have an alliance, you should come to the aid and support of an ally. Well, that'll wrap up 14.2. And until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.